India, you lived in an ashram.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, that was one in India and California. The part in India was really just a few months, but
Still, it's exposure to that other culture, other nation, other tradition.
yeah, I think one of the things that opened my eyes about being was I realized that people there just really have a completely different concept of time, and their culture really affects like how their culture really affects how they operate day to day. And we have there's a sort of discussion going around right now about how different cultures producing different outcomes, and that's, some people think that's sort of a right wing position to take, but people in India have just a circular sense of time, and they're in no hurry to do anything, and they're very content, or at least they're very at peace with their lot in life. There's not this driving ambition to be more, to gain more.
Sounds healthier than we are.
Although that might be changing in the big cities where modern capitalism has really taken hold.
The city center.
Absolutely. I mean, the part that I was in West Bengal, the big city being Calcutta. Now that they have, Calcutta is pretty backwards and undeveloped relative to the rest of the big cities in India, in part because West Bengal has been under communist rule for at least the last 40 years, and so things have, somewhat stagnated, and
For better or for worse?
well, I from what I'm told, cities like Bombay and Delhi are quite modern and comfortable, but most of Calcutta, from what I saw, was it has this kind of glorious heritage. It was the center of the British Raj, and so there's all this colonial architecture, and you can feel that it was once, this really important city, but it's, it doesn't have that same vibrancy of a capital that it once had.
Yeah, in a conversation with a friend the other day, I just talking about, how different cultures, but also like westernization. I think we were talking about China and the big cities, how life for somebody moving from the country to the city can just change so rapidly and be so different from their family, if they leave their family in the countryside and go to live in the big city. And I think I said something like the city centers where culture goes to die. Or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Well, that's Oswald Spengler in his Decline of the West says that culture is born out of the country. It's born in rural life and the struggles that people have, trying to carve out a living on the land. That's what creates culture. And then urban centers are kind of they become these intellectual centers, and the true sense of the culture becomes lost because everything is sort of intellectualized.
Yeah, I think what I said was where tradition goes to die.
Same in this sense, same
yeah,
idea.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of a transition that goes on with human beings globally at different rates from a real use value culture where there's kind of a gift form of risk management. People give to each other when they have more, in the anticipation of reciprocation if they get into trouble. And people are producing for use or for gift. They're not so much producing for exchange of equivalents, for commodity exchange. And then when you start to get an intensity of, as population grows, as reproductive effectiveness of humanity grows, you start to get money evolving out of commodities. And once you get money evolving, then money leads to capital. And those are different social relations of production that sort of organize a society. And so what you get is not a void of culture, although it's void of some things that we value, but you get a capitalist culture. You get a culture of the worship of money and the worship of capital, of money that makes more money. And you get a culture in which time is surplus value. Time is money, time is capital. And so time becomes precious and regimented to squeeze the most new value, new monetary value out of the time you have. And so human culture really changes as you move from use value basis to exchange value basis, commodity, money, capital.
Do you think it's a necessary step in the process? Because a lot of cultures have developed money without developing capitalism over thousands of years of human history.
I think it.
Whereas
I think
capital seems to be a relatively new thing within the last,
except for
300 years or so.
mercantile capital, usurer's capital, and slave capital, latifundial slave productive capital in agriculture. There were, these antediluvian forms. But yeah, it's industrial capitalism and finance capitalism are pretty recent. But I think they're awfully contagious given the human genome. I think once there's capital or money, capital's likely to emerge, and once capital gets hold of production, you're likely to get full-blown industrial capitalism, and wherever it emerges, it's likely to sweep the world. It may not emerge in a lot of places, but if it emerges even once, it's so contagious that I think it tends to sweep the world from that locus of eruption.
Did it emerge only once?
Well, no, I think there certainly were tendencies outside the mercantile city-states of Italy and outside the United Provinces of the Netherlands and outside the United Kingdom where it was bubbling up, in France and later even in India there were beginnings of industrial capitalism that kind of got suppressed by colonialism for a while, and in Argentina and in South Africa, pretty much all over the temperate zone capitalism was getting started at a certain point, but the more dominant centers of early advance, like the UK and the United States and France, kind of suppressed for a while those other developments. Germany and Italy managed to get in on it, but it's taken longer for the BRICS to get in on it, but they have now, despite attempts to suppress that by the British sort of policy.
Were they, was it indigenous or what did it, were they influenced by Western capitalism in their efforts to?
People, from what I can read in the archaeological record, people were influencing each other all over the world, even when the means of transportation were pretty protracted. But yeah, I think there was influence, but there was also local. So it's kind of like, there's kind of like external causes and internal causes intermingling for the eruption of capitalism.
This idea of linear time is much older than capitalism or even.
But I think the capitalist clock, the surplus value clock, encourages the adoption of a sort of a de-emphasis of the cyclical aspects of life and an emphasis of linear progress, kind of in the unconscious image of the accumulation of capital itself. So I think capitalism really encourages that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I got this book or this pamphlet one time. I don't remember where I got it. I think somebody just posted it on Facebook or something. And it's titled, I think, "Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars," something like that. And it's supposedly this, maybe 40, 50-page kind of manual. Supposedly it's this, like, CIA document that, the story is, was left on a Xerox machine inadvertently, and somebody found it and, started distributing it. And, it has this sort of thing in the beginning talking about, people of superior minds should be in charge of people with inferior minds, and it's for their own good, and et cetera, et cetera.
Same old story.
But I think the gist of it, at least one of the sections, was basically how money, currency, is essentially this way of quantifying ultimately human energy, human production, and by controlling the currency, you're literally funneling or channeling human energy in one direction or another.
Central banks, the Federal Reserve.
Yeah. But they use all these mathematical formulas, and it seems really esoteric. But
I think I've encountered that. Yeah.
Bruce, could you go into, just give a sketch of Marx's idea of how use value is kind of converted into exchange value?
Yeah, it all has to do, the central concept in Marx is the growth of the social forces of production, which really, I think, is a meta-Darwinian concept. It's the self-productivity, the self-reproductivity of humanity, mediated through the artifacts that we create and the natural resources that they operate on. So as our productivity or productive force, reproductive force, and Darwinian theory is all about what entities have the faster rate of reproduction and what have the slower. So as our rate of reproduction, of social reproduction, of species self-reproduction goes up, you have the ability to produce more use values than you need locally. So you've got this surfeit of use value, this extra produce becomes non-use value for you, and yet you kind of want to get something out of it. Well, I could give it as a gift, or maybe we could trade with the neighboring tribe. They have some stuff they have too much of because their productivity has grown. We have some stuff that we have too much of because our productivity has grown. Maybe we could, swap, and so barter begins, commodity for commodity barter. And so that's kind of the earliest emergence of exchange value. There's like use value or consumption use value, direct consumption use value, and then there's exchange use and exchange use value. So initially use value bifurcates in two, and exchange value is an extended or a new branch of use value. But when money comes in and the ability to quantify that and mediate barter by money exchange, so I exchange for money, and then later I use the money to get something I want, which my initial barter partner might not have had what I want, but he had money. Mm-hmm. So I'll take the money and hold it for a while until I find the right person who has money mediated, sort of commodity exchange for money, and then money exchange for commodity, CMC. That later can invert into mercantile capital. It can become MCM prime, where you end up with more money than you started with. And that's all in the realm of circulation, the realm of circulation that develops out of barter and then out of money-mediated exchange.
Is that what you consider a profit then, or is... That
would be a profit. The M prime minus M is your delta M, your profit. Mm-hmm. And, that's kind of like a mercantile profit, which involves some real service. You're moving things around to where they're wanted, so there's some real service. It's not just all gypping people with mercantile capital, but there's an element of that. But when you get out of the realm of circulation and capital seizes production, when merchants start to buy the tools and equipment that they used to, that their suppliers used to have. Their suppliers might have been petty producers, cottage industry producers. But when they start to buy the cottages and make a big cottage that's like a manufactory, and they hire the cottage producers for a wage instead of just buying their goods, then you start to have capital entering into production. And then you're starting to produce surplus value because your productivity has gotten high enough that one of your suppliers in a day can produce a quantity of commodities that will sell for more than just the wage you paid that person. So that's where your profit comes from, that the sufficient productivity to produce for one day's work to produce more than it takes to pay for one day's life. And
so, yeah, and you know, there is something to that, you know, that money is basically just human energy, even from a Marxian standpoint.
oh
It's
yeah,
like,
I mean, exactly. It's human social reproductive energy, quantified and tokenized.
Well, this pamphlet I'm talking about made me wonder. Actually, who knows if it was real or not, but it made me wonder how much, the cabal, the capitalist cabal, used Marx to their advantage.
I think you're onto something big.
Because clearly he tapped into something. He modeled things in a way that's very useful. So I imagine there's got to be people who have used Marx, and twisted it.
Part of the ideology of the present ruling faction, although Trump is giving them a run for their money, so to speak, but part of their ideology I call anti-Marxian Marxianism. And I think in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, when they had the Great Deflation, and they began to realize that capitalism was becoming an enemy of their concentrated ownership of capital because it was becoming so productive that it was depreciating their fixed capital. When they started to realize that, they had the best minds that money can buy study Marx for them, and study Thorstein Veblen, and study others who were beginning to see the self-negation of capital through techno-depreciation. And they began to take Marx seriously. And okay, Marx predicts that the very development of capitalism will dethrone us. How do we turn what Marx discovered against that process of dethroning us? And then you get the Federal Reserve, you get the income tax. The income tax is partly to fund the setting up of dictatorships in the semi-periphery of the core capitalist countries to keep industrialization back there. Because if you have people in areas that haven't industrialized, and they're suddenly getting the latest equipment and industrializing with that, while you back home in the core have legacy equipment that's already obsolete, and they have lower labor costs initially, and they start competing with you, you're going to be wiped out. So you got to have that world system of military dictatorships in what becomes then the third world that hold back the development of capitalism there, because it threatens core capitalism, and it threatens the core owners of core capitalism and their fixed capital. So,
and any country that starts to break out of that gets the shit bombed out of them, like Iran.
yeah.
Because
Now they haven't been successful lately. I mean, for all their efforts, Brazil has industrialized to a degree, India to a degree, China to a massive degree, Taiwan, South Korea.
But
Japan was a little
they're
bit
doing
of
a
a
pretty
late
good
comer.
job keeping Africa from
Yeah.
industrializing.
But strangely enough,
a
the
lot of Middle East.
Chinese are in there building infrastructure
That's
and getting
true.
access
yeah.
to resources.
And that I just saw an article the other day that there was I don't remember the exact headline. I didn't read the article, but it was something about how the U.S. is worried about the Chinese and Russian influence in Africa industrializing.
And in general, I think what I call the Rockefeller faction of the ruling class is scared itless. I'll leave off the sh. I'll leave the sh. They're scared itless because all their efforts to hold back the growth of the productive forces, to hold back the development of middle classes all over the world in what was the third world, the semi-periphery, are increasingly failing, and they're losing control, and they're getting desperate. because they can't rule in a world of educated, somewhat prosperous, middle class, working class people.
And I have a question too, like there's some of the things I've read about the IMF and the
The
whole
IMF vampire.
well, in the whole system. I mean, basically, it has economic dominance over even places like China and
To a degree.
yes, but the only holdout is really the Islamic world, and that they have their own monetary system, and so
they have cultural cultural attitudes about usury.
yes, like which
Finance
used to
capital.
be the same as Christian attitudes, which is a whole interesting history. But I have heard that a lot of our warfare against the Islamic world is really fundamentally a kind of economic warfare, because they are the only bloc that actually doesn't have, they're not susceptible to the IMF's.
And to Federal Reserve-like central banks.
Yes.
They're
yeah.
resisting that too.
Yeah. They have their own currency, and they have their own whole
They
banking.
have a lot of oil.
And
Syria has no Federal Reserve-like central bank. for
Though they have
example.
anything
No,
now.
of course now,
Yeah.
yeah.
What do you think really was going on in Libya?
You mean when Gaddafi
Don't have
was?
much insight into that.
Mhm.
Because there's all this speculation about his designs for money. I just thought maybe you
Yeah.
had it.
I've heard some
His
of that
designs
too.
for what?
I'm ignorant about that.
Breaking free of the banking system.
Mm.
And
Well-
he was gonna not stop using the American dollar
As a
as
reserve.
the oil.
There have been challenges to the dollar as the petrocurrency, and that's, I think, bothered.
That
Our
but Gaddafi
rulers.
supposedly was going to stop doing it.
And Syria and Iran have been involved in such things. So
Mhm. Yeah, we got to keep them down for sure.
I know that he was, like a Pan-Africanist. I always thought that probably had something to do with it, empowering and uniting Africa in some fashion is obviously not.
Well, Hillary really wanted to take him down for some reason. So.
Yeah.
yeah, there's. I think you're right. There's a story there, and I just haven't penetrated it.
So what about, Chad and I were talking earlier today about the word populism, and how it's got this connotation of right-wing proto-fascism, and how strange that is, that's, you do hear left-wing populism, but it's always qualified as left-wing populism. How strange that is that populism has become a term for
I
right-wing.
think the.
Like Bundy.
I think
the Bundys.
I think the anti-Trump ruling class, the Rockefeller faction of the ruling class, is determined to smear populism as much as they can. They fear it. It's challenging them. It's a real threat to their power. And Trump is in a way is an expression of real populism. They like to talk about, of course, progressivism, which is people are pollution ideology basically these days. It's global warming austerity ideology, but they hate populism because it's democratic and it's doesn't accept their
Well, it's not
ideology.
necessarily-
Not necessarily Democrat.
Well, not. I mean, you can get fascist.
You have,
out of it.
I
yeah,
was
you have
thinking
the rise. You have
But
the
I think
rise
the
of
impulse in this country of populism
Right-wing-
is basically democratic.
right-wing autocrats being swept into power by populist movements
Yeah.
across the world. You have that.
Yeah.
You have that
In
across
India.
Europe. You have that in Brazil. You have that in India.
But I think I think fascists like Hitler.
But like anytime there's, any kind of populism on the left, like with Bernie Sanders, like with the
Crush it.
what's his name in Britain,
Corbyn.
Corbyn. Yeah.
Where the Labour Party had a huge surge, but the media over there was just and here too. I saw an article today where this article was outlining all of the Washington Post articles that were anti-Sanders, and there was this one where they came out with like 16 anti-Sanders articles in 16 hours.
Oh, wow. Well, you know,
And
I
then
mean,
another day it was like 7 within 4 hours.
But I think
the
right
whole-
populism and fascism, I think that those are the ruling faction's way of co-opting populist movements.
also,
You know, Hitler was massively financed by the Rockefellers and other parts of that faction through the Brown and Harriman Bank. Prescott Bush saw to that as when the Bush family first got into the lower plutocracy. He was their
There was a lot
point
of
man.
investment from the United States into Nazi Germany.
And
Yeah.
eugenics was massively funded by the Rockefellers in Germany, and that's what led to the extermination camps.
what I was going to say is also speaking of Clinton and a lot of the very centrist or even what I consider to be kind of right-wing Democrats, but I guess they're not the same.
Not in the current. Like,
Yeah, they're not.
skewed spectrum.
No, they're considered moderates, but the
corporatists.
neoliberal are they're that whole ideology. But anyway, I read some very interesting articles about all the whole tech. These tech giants all supported the Clintons, like Alphabet, which is what Google's parent company. I mean, the head of Alphabet, I can't think of his name, starts with an S, I think. Anyway, he actually loaned experts to provide security and tech support for Hillary Clinton, and as I understood it from things I read, that there was a kind of universal front in the big tech companies to support the Clintons and all, the Democratic Central Committee, and of course the Washington Post is Bezos.
Yes,
he bought that, and of course.
But they're totally independent.
Yeah,
He doesn't tell them
That's
what
right.
to do.
Right.
That's right. I forgot that part.
Yeah, don't read Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent by any means. Like that doesn't clue you into like how their narrative is.
Sweden just changed. Is that a problem?
I think it's still going, but yeah, maybe I should check on that. I tried to turn off the go to sleep thing. Okay, we're still rolling.
It still says it's recording.
Yeah. I cleared up a bunch of disk space.
Oh yeah.
Oh, fabulous.
And I paid Google some money to get more cloud storage.
Also, they're watching it too.
Oh, yes.
Well, I hope it's entertaining for them.
Yeah, you know.
To hear their name mentioned and all.
When I was in the ashram, when we had, like some question about something or other, we'd say, we'll just consult Shri Google.
Shri Google,
Shri
yeah.
Google.
Yeah.
The enlightened
Yeah.
AI.
I remember there were some heavy people in the Hare Krishna movement at a certain point, with machine guns
I think that's true.
yeah.
That's sort of a different camp than the one that I joined, but they took their mission seriously, I guess.
Very.
Well, let's go with that for a second, because I think it's interesting the way that people that are into more spiritual culture have been getting drawn into right-wing politics, and something that Ryan and I have talked a lot about before, and something that I think would be interesting to explore more, and why that is, and what the left can do to...
Well, I mean, Marxism was explicitly atheist. I mean, I don't think that's
I've thought
relevant,
about this, and for me, the pithy short answer is, I think because the right wing recognizes the necessity, even the primacy of metaphysics, that is to say, values, beliefs, over material dialectism. I think for me that's on some level what I appreciate about the right wing. That's a potent understanding of humans that a lot of people just really just goes over their head. You know, that it's, I mean, essentially psychological. You know, they understand human needs in a way, like on a psychological basis, I think.
The need to believe. Yeah, and that's, I mean, to tie that into the populism thing that we were talking about, the more they try to push the definition of populism to the right, the more they funnel those people over there, and so then they kind of surge up rather than going the other way. Possibly because they can control that. I don't know. Do you have any ideas about that?
It's interesting because I'm reading now the articles that are about that. Did anybody see? I don't have a TV and I don't watch stuff like this too much, but OPB did a series called Bundyville about both Clive and Ammon Bundy. I mean, starting with that, and it was really interesting. I'm like the serialization in print. I'm only on I think segment 2. It's a very long thing to go through all of it. But
who are the Bundys?
Oh, Clive Bundy was a rancher in, I don't know, Nevada. And there's kind of some connection with Mormonism, too. I don't know if he was actually a Mormon, but some very conservative Mormons.
They had some standoffs with the federal government.
Right,
Oh,
yeah.
right.
And it was over cattle grazing fees that are charged for grazing cattle on federal land, which those ranchers are pretty dependent on being able to use that rangeland. And Clive Bundy refused to pay his cattle grazing fees, and the feds came after him, and there was this big standoff and armed standoff,
Right.
and people flocked from all over, like various conservative places in the West, to go to his ranch and be part of this rebellion, and the feds stood down and let Bundy get away with it, and so it was like this big triumph. Well, then Clive Bundy's sons, Ammon, and I don't know if anybody remember the second son's name anyway. They all went to Eastern Oregon a couple years ago and took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and there was they took it for like 66 days. It was a huge
Armed occupation.
And they ended up getting acquitted in court.
Yeah, subsequently, although
one person was killed.
Vinicum, was killed. They were like leaving, they were giving up, I think, the occupation, and they were leaving Malheur. And people were really upset about the whole thing because the Bundys had come in support of 2 ranchers who were convicted of, what were they convicted of? Some disobeying some rule, I think, setting fire or something to land that they didn't own and couldn't have, I can't remember, but anyway, they came in support of them, and they took over the refuge, but people were really upset because they trashed the whole place, and they also
desecrated native
and
sacred sites.
Yeah, they did a
land.
bunch of things that
it was mostly people not from that town.
Yes, because I think a lot of people started to be against what the Bundys and that group was against. But it was very interesting because I'm reading about this and about the threads of, the spirituality and the values, and about how it was this coalescing point for all sorts of spiritual, ethical, anti-abortion. I mean, everything was all rolled into this stand up against the federal government that's taking away the rights of people and imposing this sort of, godless ideology or something. But anyway, if you apparently can watch this OPB series, Bundyville, online or on TV or something, but probably best online now. But anyway,
Yeah, I followed the story a little bit when it was
happening.
happening,
me
and,
too.
and thereafter. Yeah, it's a really complex. It seems like there's a lot to unpack there.
And some of it was very interesting because federal agents infiltrated part of it, and there was a series of bombings that happened later too.
Agent provocateur. maybe?
Yes, and the question as this investigative journalism unfolds is who was really responsible for this bombing, because it sounds like the federal agents pushed and pushed and pushed and gave money and supplies and materials and kind of went,
Sounds like entrapment.
it
Standard
does,
practice.
yes. And anyway, it's
Yeah.
I haven't finished this, but it's
Mm.
interesting reading.
To check
But
that out.
anyway, that's sort of taking up this idea that the right wing, it stands for these values of, these ethical or moral or spiritual values that they see that the larger culture
I
doesn't have.
think religion, maybe it doesn't have to be, but in these contexts, it's usually an authoritarian construct. And it usually involves mystification, so that there are leaders who are closer to God, and then there's the laity who are, sinners and denigrated to some degree. And religions typically involve, in my experience and studies, involve hierarchies of exploitation. There's a lot of exploitation of the lower levels by the higher levels. And all that authoritarianism that supports that, I think, breeds dictatorial outcomes.
I think they're aware that people are drawn to that, and there is something like you were saying too, the metaphysics that people, I think it's inherent in people that there are like these metaphysical aspects that capture people's imaginations, and maybe there's this deeper drive to have a spiritual life, and so these authoritarian hierarchies take advantage of that.
Could there be a spirituality, maybe paganism was somewhat like that at some times, but could there be a spirituality that was non-authoritarian?
Well, I think
it's
so.
possible.
I think, like, the right-wing populist movement, they are saying they want somebody who's, I mean, in some ways, they're always deferring to some leader, but at the same time, they want somebody who's going to, look after them, take care of them. It's not like, how can we serve you, but hey, what can you do for us?
And I think that's the relationship with Trump and the Christian right. I mean, Trump, to my understanding and perception, is not really credible as a religious leader.
That is a definite understatement.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Yeah,
But they latched onto him,
And he's delivering for them.
Oh yeah,
As
and
you're-
he's done this. Yeah, he uses the language. He
Stopping illegal immigration, rising wages, the longest recovery in the history of the United
Yeah.
States, low unemployment.
so
He's delivering a lot.
I heard this interview some years ago with this alt-right luminary head, Greg Johnson. He's kind of a different faction than Richard Spencer, but in this interview, he was kind of laying out his case for his point of view, and he was saying, we talk about human needs like, everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants shelter, safety, food, raise their families in peace. And he's saying, well, is that all that makes us human? If that's the level that we're saying that we have in common, everybody wants these things, well, yeah, obviously everybody wants these things, but we're much more than that. And, we're these cultural beings, these creative beings. And, that's what makes us more than animals, is one. And so, that's how he kind of lays out the importance of culture, above just these kind of material human needs.
I think what we want, in my observation, what we want is human flourishing. And that involves a very colorful way of life with lots of art and music and philosophy, and as well as just the basic sustenance of life. And I see that human flourishing peeking out momentarily at Woodstock and in Ashland, Oregon, and sometimes at the country fair, the Oregon Country Fair, and I haven't been there, so I can't. But I've seen films of it that make me wonder if there's not some of that going on.
I think there's something too. The culture, the festival culture, like there's something about it draws people there, and there's this spirit of
community.
Community,
Yes.
and I mean this is the same reason people go to church. It's not just
God.
It's not just God.
And
it's
yet
the
the
community
churches, in
aspect.
my experience, are
I think
so
is
constrained.
really what glues.
Depends on the church.
Some are different. I know.
The Unitarian
Unitarians are
Church,
somewhat
they
different.
never
I know.
mention God. I have to give them credit for that. Not that I'm not spiritual, but
And this kind of flourishing we're talking about is kind of democratic. I mean, it spontaneously rises from a large group of people, and people are creating beauty and creating breathtaking moments of experience all over the place in an unordered, unmilitarized way.
But why does the right wing think that the left is destroying that possibility?
Maybe the right wing is more afraid of that kind of flourishing.
They want the authoritarian kind of.
Well, it's.
I think they're. I think in a lot of ways they're against the kind of.
What I'm talking
culture
about.
and
It's very interesting. I'm just going to bring up a particular thing about this, but so go ahead. I mean, if you want, I want to bring it up though after that. Oh,
Go ahead.
sure.
Yeah.
Well,
Sure.
I interrupted, but okay. Well,
Interruptions
all right.
are allowed.
Okay, so I've been involved in yoga and now have become, I have at least a certificate as a yoga teacher. So I'm interested in the news, and there's a very interesting article, I don't know where it was, The Atlantic maybe, about how the increasing use of yoga in schools, and this is happening all over. But as there's, of course, the enclaves are the East Coast and the West Coast, and in the South, like for example in Alabama, it's against the law to have it in the schools, but it's all associated with this thing that's very interesting to me about the concept of mindfulness and its role in trauma and its role in healing, which is sort of taking at least psychotherapy right now by storm. It's pretty interesting transformation into this more somatic-based kind of way of healing. Everybody's adopting it. I mean, schools all over the place because they have so many issues with kids, and the kids are like, I think, in our culture, like, just like kind of deformed by the toxicity of so much of it. And so anyway, schools have embraced yoga and mindfulness to this huge extent, but in the South, it's like there's this huge backlash, and there's been court cases and stuff when schools have introduced yoga, and what they're
Meditation is equated with conspiring with the devil or consorting with the devil among certain Christian.
It's teaching religion because, for example, I mean, yoga is a.
they're like, if we can't have prayer in school, then
That's exactly what they're
yoga.
saying. That's
okay.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's exactly what
Because
they're
it's
saying.
Hinduism, right?
And yeah, it's there's
comes
it's
out of,
two-fronted.
a tradition that they don't like.
Right. It's two-fronted. One is that, like the more liberal objection may be, they don't let any teaching in school, and this goes against that, and they, all the Sanskrit words and the whole concept with
Even
what.
as westernized as yoga's become.
Well, that's what people are saying. Well, it's possible to teach yoga and kind of like strip out pretty much most of that.
The theology can be left out.
Yeah, but then the other objection is basically
Cultural
that
appropriation at that point.
they don't want these schools teaching this, what's the right word?
Heathen.
Heathen, thank you. Heathen religion in their school. And so it's really interesting to read about this whole issue that, because in this area, they, like, for instance, I applied for this job. Willamette Lane has this youth yoga instructor, and they have an after-school program, and the kids, play. I don't know. They play basketball, and they do gymnastics, or they, all sorts of things. But one of the things they do is yoga, and so they have a job in their after-school program as a yoga teacher for kids, and so it's around here. It's like, and this is pretty liberal, so it's pretty accepted, and there's like never any question like, whoa, you should be doing this with our kids. But in other places in the country, it's a huge source of in these lawsuits and all sorts of stuff. So I think it's very interesting because it's kind of an example again of like what's secular and where do you draw the line, and what about, these Sanskrit terms? They're just names, right? But is this, the actual religion? Is this teaching, the concepts of mindfulness and presence, and even the focus on the body kind of goes against a certain strain of Christian spirituality. So it's just interesting to me.
Christian dogma, I would say.
Yeah, but it's one way in which that the more conservative factions, I guess you'd say, and parents and stuff, are objecting to teaching religion in the school because it happens to be not their religion.
Yeah, they're okay with it until
Yeah, right. It's this heathen thing.